Continuing the theme that there are people who are genuinely concerned about climate change but are not always able to act, as we saw before in the last chapter on religion and ethics of climate change. We said just exposing people to the risks or informing them about the risks they face without a clear action plan on how they can act to reduce their own risks is not may not be a good thing. It increases climate anxiety. Nonetheless, we have a lot of these kinds of figures which shows that the warming climate observed in recent decades is not natural. Human activities such as extensive use of fossil fuels are causing it. We people are now the main actors in climate change. The destiny of the planet is in our hands. So this is there are many hundred ways of doing this kind of a figure about sustainability, about saving the planet, about ending the climate crisis, and demanding actions from governments, and so on and so forth. All very evocative, very nice, very artistic, very informative, but what are they doing? So we have to unfortunately also deal with things like the Al Gore syndrome, where again the message is separated from the messenger by deliberative vested interests who can say Al Gore owns a private jet. Al Gore travels a lot around the world. So there is even an Urban Dictionary a phrase called the Al Gore syndrome, where it's defined as a state of two-facedness, often found around a great luxury. For example, fossil fuel emissions are killing the world. I guess I'll fly around in a jet that burns the most fossil fuels. Dude, you have Al Gore syndrome. Hardcore. Okay? That's pretty rough, right? So Al Gore has his justification as to why he needs to own a jet and needs to fly around. I don't even know if he owns a jet in reality. I should have checked it, but you can check it. But it doesn't matter, because this kind of misinformation can take hold and people can begin to use that to dismiss messages about the bad effects of fossil fuel burning. Plus, the more subtle thing is to see if Al Gore actually needs to travel, and the impact of his messaging on climate change actions can more than compensate for his carbon footprint, for example. Plus, there are other issues. I believe that travel has always been good for cultural exchanges, for exposing ourselves to other cuisines, cultures, languages, which is a good thing. So how do we deal with this? There is a systemic change needed where people can travel without damaging the environment, versus personal choices about cutting out unnecessary travel. But who defines unnecessary travel? So this becomes very complicated very soon. I don't know what happened there. Sorry. Okay. This is another figure saying the earth is warming just as surely as if it were immersed in a warm bath. Again, beautiful, evocative, good messaging, but can you reach the non-believer, the high fruit? Okay. And then there are many books being written by climate scientists and people who are environmental activists and so on, which use words like climate war, the planet is burning, planet is dying, climate crises. There is some debate about whether these are actually even appropriate words to use. We talked about story and metaphors, but the planet is not really ending. We may die, but the planet will be around. Biology will not end, because as they say, nature makes the rules and biology finds the loopholes. So we haven't been around except for the last few million years. So planet has had many mass extinctions, meteorite strikes, and so on. But life survives. So we have to be aware of using words that are alarmist in the name of end justifies the means kind of approach may not be good for us as climate scientists or people who are trying to bring about climate action. You do not want to scare people, because climate stress is a real thing. So much messaging is done every day. I will show in the end how many climate stories appear in the media around the world on average. And people feel that they have risk from climate change, but they don't necessarily know what they can do, or even if they do everything, whether that'll reduce the overall risk for themselves. Right? It's a very complicated issue. So there is the New Scientist article that talks about 8 tips for managing eco-anxiety. I won't go through the list, but you can look it up. This is another idea of the righteous mind from people like Jonathan Haidt and used by Dan and Chip Heath, which talks about how the brains themselves are wired very differently. This is pretty obvious by now, okay? So they have in the center the common sense lobe with self-interest cluster, absolute moral standards, talk radio reception, and there is lots of things here which are real. There is the neuroscience of how we perceive things, right? There is always the debate about whether truth is absolute or is it relative. Okay, there are many experiments that show that people watch an accident, they are eyewitnesses to an accident, and when they tell the story of what happened, they can be very different based on what they think they saw, even though they both saw it, same thing. Okay, the socialist brain of a liberal Democrat. So this is for conservative Republican. This is not about politics. I'm just pointing out that the perceptions of climate change, especially the climate change and actions needed, are being perceived very differently by different groups, unlike astrophysics or medical science, for example. Of course, there is also the controversy about the vaccines. Misinformation based on wrong science was spread that vaccines cause autism, Down syndrome, and so on. Even though it's disproven by now, there is still anti-vaxxer movement. This is going to play a big role in the COVID vaccine. Can governments force people to take a COVID vaccine? If not, how do you protect everybody? Big problems, right? And they are kind of lessons for climate action as well. The socialist brain of a liberal Democrat, on the other hand, is supposed to be dominated by the PC lobe in the center, which is the politically correct thing that conservatives look down upon, make fun of, and so on. Speech codes, multiculturalism, alternative lifestyles, racial quotas, and so on. And there is double-think section in the gray area, so lots of differences. So what can we say? Okay, so there is embedded groupthink here in the collectivist network device, whereas they have what is called keep what you earn area. So whether government even has the right to tax us and use the tax to run social programs and so on and so forth. So many different issues become kind of congealed into political choices. So climate change then becomes part of the political football. So climate change communication then becomes part of the political discourse instead of just science exchange. So then you have to be really very careful about how you go about it, communicating science in a political value system. Okay, this is again the climate communication website that Richard Somerville and his colleagues run. But I hope you are trying to get, beginning to get an idea of how much work is needed before you jump on to becoming a climate change scientist. Just because you got a climate change degree of some sort and you know the IPCC doesn't immediately make you an expert.